Hello, I am your host, Tracy Atsuka. Thank you so much for joining me here for another episode of ADHD for Smartass Women. You know that my purpose is always to show you who you are and then inspire you to be it. And in the thousands of ADHD women that I've had the privilege of meeting, I've never met a one that wasn't truly brilliant at something. Not one. So, of course, I am just delighted to introduce you to Dr. Lorre Laws. Dr. Lorre Laws, affectionately known as Dr. Lorre, is a compassionate healer, best-selling author, and integrative nursing professor with more than 35 years of experience in holistic health. Her work centers on trauma recovery, which is especially relevant for individuals with ADHD, as unresolved trauma often intensifies attention challenges and emotional dysregulation. In her best selling book, Nursing Our Healer's Heart, Dr. Lorre shares innovative strategies for healing burnout and trauma, tools that are particularly powerful for bright, capable women navigating life with ADHD. Through her nonprofit, the Haelan Academy, she leads transformational programs that help women process trauma, reduce stress, and reconnect with their potential, improving focus, emotional resilience, and overall well being. Welcome, Dr. Lorre. Did I get all of that right?
Yes, and thank you so much for that beautiful introduction. It's humbling when you hear everything in one short soundbite. And so thank you. I'm so grateful to be here, and I am so thrilled about our community, your community of smart ass women. Because I am here to be with y'all.
Oh, I love it. Okay, so what we always do is we talk about the ADHD diagnoses first of our guests. In your case, I'm going to say it's lack of diagnoses,
Yeah.
but I understand you have a grown daughter who has ADHD, and we know it's as heritable as height. And what happened to you when you went in to get diagnosed?
Yeah, well, I have just to kind of set the context, I have a profound trauma history, which, is why I ended up in my research. I started studying trauma because not only was I curious about what was happening with my colleagues, but I was trying to understand how to navigate myself, and I was not. At that time diagnosed with ADHD, and nor I'm let's say quasi-ish diagnosed. So what happened is my two adult daughters were living with me after the pandemic, and kind of getting their young adult life started, going to school and getting themselves sorted. And they hadn't lived with me for several years and came back. And in that time, my youngest daughter was diagnosed with ADHD, and she had sent me all of the studies, and she had an exhaustive and excellent workup, right? And so we knew exactly what part of the brain, we knew exactly what types of support she needed. Now, mind you, she was 21 at the time, so not helpful for her early education, but helpful for her to navigate the road ahead. And so, as we're living together, as all of us sort of did during that time, life became a little dynamic. And so they got to see their mother through the eyes of adult children, which we all kind of go through that transition. And my daughters are like, Mom, you have worse ADHD than I do, she would say. And I was like, I don't see it. But then that planted a seed. And so I kind of tuned my awareness in to that. And I started noticing many of the behaviors. Like, I don't do one thing at a time. I do 25 things, and I think I'm serial processing, but and so I can see, like, I'm unloading the groceries, and then I'm folding the laundry, and then I'm responding to an email, and I've got all of these, all of 10 other tasks that are going. And I had never really noticed that about myself. So I said, well, yes, after some time in reflection and just observing, I'm like, I think you're onto something. And so let me go get a workup. And I have good insurance, and I had access to healthcare, which was a blessing. And so off I went. And they did one test, and one test only. And I don't recall, and I apologize, 'cause I meant to look up the name of the test, but it's the one where you sit in front of the computer for like 40 minutes and you sort things, right?
Was it Toba?
It might have been Toba. Thank you. Thank you. And so I did the one assessment only. That's it. And then I had my follow up with the provider. So I had my session, and he said, well, your score was like perfect. Like there is nothing here. But what's on your intake form, what you describe, certainly suggests. But we are not, don't get me started on how this works, because I also teach healthcare quality improvement. So here we go. I'm scooting my soapbox away from my feet right now because I'm not going to get on this one. But we're not going to pursue any further because clearly it's not affecting you. You are a university professor. You have earned a PhD. So whatever underlying situation you have, well, you're doing just fine.
So you are great at masking, right, Dr. Lorre?
I think really for in my particular case and many others, I think my trauma history and how my brain has adapted to severe trauma over a long period of time. I mean, if we listed the whole spectrum of types of trauma, individual, collective, short-term, long-term, acute, hyperacute, occupational, I could have one of those sandwich boards, front and back covered, and I could be walking. But all in service to getting me to where I needed to be, which is to do the research, which is to write the book, which is to be of service to healers and health professionals worldwide. So I don't, while you're in it and you're doing that deep trauma healing work, it doesn't feel divinely guided. But I do see that is part of my dharma, in this earth walk, and I have embraced it. But I think in my case, the masking came from my hypervigilance in a trauma response. And so the safe place for me has always been school. And so my need to be safe and excel in school overrode whatever neurospiciness that may have been there. And so I just got conditioned in that manner. And the better, as a grade school student and middle school student, the better I did, the more positive feedback from life that I received that filled, a void that was a trauma void. So I think our brain doesn't really care. At the end of the day, our brain doesn't care if we put an ADHD concept on it or a PTSD, or the brain is going to adapt exactly how it needs to adapt in service to your survival.
So when you're telling me that story, is that an example of, do I have the right terminology? You will correct me if I don't. Is it called post-traumatic growth?
I would say that yes, that is the correct term, and thank you for being so well informed on these important topics, because every person on the planet has a trauma history. Every person on the planet has some degree of, it's called unintegrated or unhealed trauma that is stored in the body, right? And so and that's part of the work that I do is guide, whether it's through the book or in my academy programs, is I guide people from that post-traumatic stress. And it's not just PTSD. And this is kind of the big emergence from my research that really we need to just share with your beautiful community, is that it's not necessarily PTSD that's wreaking havoc for many of us. It is the unintegrated or the unhealed trauma that is stored in the body, that I call it unhealed bits of wisdom, because those unhealed bits of wisdom, when the reason they got stored in the body in the first place, and then went on to affect how our brains adapt and work, and how our behaviors resulting from those adaptations are manifested, the reason they got stored in the first place is because we didn't have the people or the resources or the support that we needed before, during, and after the event. And so our body stores them, usually in the fascia, in the muscles, and in the neuroplexes are the top three places. They stay there. They lie, it's like a dormant virus or something. It just kind of hangs out there until it's either has an external or an internal stressor that activates it, because I don't use the trigger word. That's a very aggressive word. I don't know why that's in the trauma literature.
I hate that word too. I love activate.
Or I'll say it comes online. It comes online, even more neutral, right? Because it's like a dimmer switch, right? It's in the body, and depending upon what is happening in your external environment and or your internal environment. And this is where that's why each of us are so unique, how we present as smartass women with ADHD, and how we present in the world with our trauma history that you can't separate the two, because the brain is adapting to everything that it is experiencing. It's only the what Dan Siegel would call our upstairs brain, our prefrontal off-frontal cortex, that puts the labels on. But the rest of this is happening below that in the midbrain and the limbic system, amongst other places. So anyway, yes, the journey is no matter whether it is unintegrated trauma, which every person on the planet has, that is wreaking havoc in our physiology, not only our brains, and we can go into that if it's a topic of interest, and through that, how to learn the language of your vagus nerve and your autonomic nervous system. Let's start with that, and your limbic system. Learn that language, and then learn how to navigate it, and then insulate yourself from the external, threats to your safety as perceived by the midbrain, or the internal unhealed bits of wisdom that will emerge when conditions are favorable for healing. Not always conveniently timed, and almost always not comfortable, but always in service to our growth. I've walked this journey myself, and I have facilitated thousands in arriving at what you described accurately as post-traumatic growth. And we use a lot of principles of neuroplasticity to reprogram those synaptic connections so that we can get out of survival mode, where most of us are stuck at the cellular level, not to mention what's going on in our autonomic nervous system, into thrive mode. Post-traumatic growth is a stepping stone to that ultimate destination.
Is trauma every time that you don't feel safe?
I mean, fundamentally, it's a threat to safety or a perceived threat to safety. Okay, so for example, if a person experienced a sexual assault of some sort, and then they are in the dentist chair 30 years later, and there's a sound from one of the hoses that sounds like a man's belt coming off fast, that can, create a recurrence. That's a true story from my history. So trauma is what happens that exceeds our capacity to process and integrate at the time, largely because we don't have the people and the resources that we need. And it's a before, during, and after. All right. And so what happens, and this is The Body Keeps Score by
Vanderkolk?
and so he did, and Gabor Mate and so many did so much research, and Stephen Porges in particular. But yes, and so we get to that point where if we aren't able to process and integrate wholly, which the whole planet just went through a pandemic, so that's all of us, right? All of us, because everybody was so quick, like we got to get back to normal, as if normal was so great to begin with.
Right. And I feel, Lorre, that what is going on in our country right now is literally unprocessed trauma.
Yeah, we have PTSD in the collective now. That's exactly what's happening. So everybody's walking around with unintegrated or unhealed trauma. And through my work, I call it unhealed bits of wisdom. And then depending on our inner and outer landscapes, if we get a cue that there's a threat to danger, and it could be something as innocuous as a dental instrument and a routine procedure, but there's a sound that midbrain picks up as a danger and puts you into a whole thing, a whole response, which is again in service to your survival. And so when we are walking around and living our lives, whether it's with our colleagues or our loved ones, I always like to refer to Dr. Bruce Perry, his book, and What Happened to You. And I always mention it because we are such a conditioned as a society and as humans to always be, living in this state of duality, the contrast, the comparison, the judgment. And I don't mean that in a negative way, but it's just how our brains have been conditioned, right? And some of us are more analytical than other. And there's also a trauma response that's called left shiftedness. I don't know if you're familiar with the work of Ian McGilchrist, who talks about how we kind of adapt over to the left hemisphere, where it's logical and it's orderly and it's structured, at the cost of, because we can't or don't have capacity to do the feels, the subjective, the non-structured. And so many of us are left shifted in our hemispheres, and we're so task oriented, so task driven, and that is how we can feel utterly alone inside despite being in a room filled with our loved ones, because we have this disconnectedness and this left shiftedness within.
Who was the researcher that you just mentioned? I don't know his work with the left shiftedness.
Yeah, it's Ian McGilchrist, and he wrote a book, something like The Brain and Its Emissary. And I talk about that in the early chapters of my book. I walk the readers through, more like as we are having a conversation. So there's lots of scientific journal, peer-reviewed journal articles and textbooks, but they're not accessible to most people. And so it was really important to me. I self-funded my research. This book is for $20. It's available worldwide. You can have it and have me in your living room with you. And we're having a conversation about, for example, this left shiftedness, just like you and I are. It's like, oh, I didn't realize that when I'm under stress, and this was part of my daughters were helping me, kind of tune into this ADHD. They're like, Mom, whenever you're under stress, you go to work. You go get on your computer. You can't see your own blind spots. It's like, oh my gosh, I'm left shifting. That is one of my trauma responses, is that I left shift into my intellect instead of sitting in my feels and the discomfort of, maybe some neurospiciness or maybe some unhealed bit of wisdom that is finding its way to the surface. And so we left shift because we don't want to feel that because it's uncomfortable.
Wow. Yeah, we get into action, we get productive. And I think that the ADHD brain does that especially well, especially when we're talking about combined type like hyperactives, where we've learned, right, that when we're in action, we feel better. But what we're also doing is trying to push away the feels.
Right. And society rewards us for that, which is so sad. We're not human beings, we're human doings. And that, this is where the left shiftedness is another representation of that. And so finding our way, unwinding my work, let us unwind individually and collectively the trauma that we have stored in our body. And now our cells, there's some research that's relatively new called cell danger response theory by Dr. Robert Naviaux, and he puts out, like, this is incredibly complex science. So unless you have a big background in biology or physiology, it would be difficult reading. But I break it down very simply in my book, and essentially what happens is at the cellular level, because of the inordinate amount of chronic stress, which we are not built for, and the inordinate amount of trauma that each of us are carrying in our bodies, because as a society, we don't normalize this conversation. We don't talk about unhealed trauma. We just left shift and keep going forward. And so what has happened, and why so many people have migraines, chronic fatigue syndrome, gut dysbiosis, IBS, anxiety, depression, metabolic syndrome by a shared pathway, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, they are all connected to this cell danger response, which is essentially in the cell, not to get too geeky, but we have in every cell of our body, we have this little suborganelle called a mitochondria, and it produces all of the energy, and it also modulates hormones and has 1,000 other jobs, but we're going to only leave it right there. And so what happens is that the cell gets it gets stuck in its own version of flight or fight. It gets stuck in a danger response. And then those mitochondria can't produce the energy that we need, which is why come your days off and you have all these beautiful plans and you're looking forward to them, and you have date night with your partner, and you're going to your kids this or that, and you're brunching with your friends, whatever, what you're hiking and taking a picnic, whatever your bliss is, but you're literally dragging yourself off the couch, or maybe not even going because you don't have the energy. And society thinks, and we are conditioned to think, that then we must be lazy, when there must be something wrong with us. Well, no, you're having a natural physiological response. This all ties with our ADHD. How do we thrive with, all of the ways in which that our body and our brain has adapted to all that we've endured? And so, most people start, well, I just need to do more self-care, because that's the mainstream, well, go meditate. Well, first of all, if you're in sympathetic overdrive or you have ADHD, meditation may not be available to you, you know?
So that's the perfect segue. If an ADHD woman, which I'm sure there are many, many, are listening to this and they can relate, where do they start? What do we do?
I start with what emerged from my research and what I present in the book. It's called the innate care plan. So each of us have an innate capacity for healing and an innate capacity. Our body's always, 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 no matter what, even when it's dying, working towards homeostasis and optimal wellness. And so we don't start with the ADHD symptoms. While those obviously are something that we are living with and are managing, and they're a lens through which how we function in the world, so not to minimize any of that, but let us get to the underlying cause, which is we need to start first and foremost with our autonomic nervous system and our vagus nerve, because that is what is sending the signaling to the parts of the brain that then get filtered through or expressed through perhaps ADHD or post-traumatic disorder, or unintegrated trauma, or a host of other things. So I have a formula, and it's called 3A's plus B leads us to the 3R's. And the goal is the 3R's. So let's start with where we are going. So where we're going is we need to be, number one, the first R is be regulated in our nervous system for all of the reasons we just described and more. The second R is that sense of reconnection within ourselves, getting out of that left shiftedness into more whole, balanced brain coherence. And this does directly affect how our ADHD-ness will be expressed, right? We want to have that brain coherence, that balance, so that the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere are collaborating effectively, for Pete's sake. Let's do that. So that's the second one, is reconnection. When that happens, then we are more readily able to be witness to it and a participant in our inner world. And by virtue of that happening now, because we're in ventral vagal tone, because we are regulated in our nervous system, we are in our window of tolerance, now we can reconnect with the loved ones in our lives, the people that we care about, in ways that may not have been available. So we have regulation, we have reconnection, and the third one is restoration of our healer's heart. So if you just take one hand and put it over your heart, and then maybe take your other hand and just feel your heart for a minute, and you'll notice that brings your stress right down just immediately. That of itself is a grounding. And now we tune into just the remembering the love that we are, the love, the unconditional love that is here for us every waking moment of every waking day. All we have to do is be present for it, to receive, and then we connect with our why for what matters most in our life, right? So that's our goal, or the 3R's: regulation, reconnection, restoration of our healer's heart. So how do we get there? Most people start with all the self-care things that we don't need to review those. We all know what self-care is, right?
Scary things.
Right, and if they're important. I don't use the word self-care in my work because the people in my community, I'm working with nurses and healers and healthcare professionals, we've been gaslighted by the term self-care, right? So I don't use it, but we'll use it here because it's something that we all know what that means. So most people start there, and it's like, well, I went for a walk and I took a bubble bath and I played with my pets and I felt better for a couple of hours, and then I was right back where I started. It alleviates symptoms, but it doesn't address root cause. So what do? What we do is we go, okay, well, what is the foundation? What is the foundation? The foundation are the 3A's. So if you're thinking of a house, you want that house built with, you want rebar, and you want to have all the steel and the stainless steel and the concrete. You want that foundation to be really strong before you build anything like self-care on top of it. So the 3A's are the foundation. And the first A is awareness, being aware of your nervous system and in what state your nervous system is as you move through the day, because it fluctuates, it varies, right? And so we're having a great conversation around awareness around that today. So everybody's doing the first A already, right? We're already doing it, and there's more where that came from. And then the second A is attending. I have over 100 practices in my book that once we know the language of our nervous system and how to navigate it, right? We understand what circuits and hybrids that we are experiencing at any given moment. And then we can map out what practices are best to attend to our nervous system state. So we can nurture and nourish our nervous system so we can either stay in regulation or return to regulation. Single most important thing right there is nervous system regulation, because even for smart ass women with ADHD, I mean, it is that important. So that's the second A. So we have awareness, we have attending, and then the third A becomes possible. And for many of us, it is not possible right now. The third A is alignment. And alignment is being attentive to our inner landscape and looking for correspondence or incongruence in the life that we're living externally. Often, most of us have a mismatch between the life that we crave, we yearn for, that we plan for, and what we're experiencing in our external world, because we are being reactive to those instead of being responsive from a place of inner peace and silence and nervous system regulation. Because and it's hard. This is not a judgment. Most of us can't get there because we're so left shifted.
Yeah.
As a trauma response, we've lost that connection, the coherence. And so we kind of do a lot of exercises around let's get that communication system. Now that we're getting nervous system regulation, now that we're getting better brain coherence, better balanced collaboration between our right and left hemispheres, well, then now we can be present to the deeper yearnings of our soul or our heart's desires, however one frames that, and then make the changes that we need to affect those in our external life. But most of us are just reactive and we're in survival mode. And the more that we stay in that sort of reactivity and that unintegrated trauma, and 91% of nurses have one or more PTSD symptom. 100% of us have unintegrated trauma.
I have never met a nurse without, I'd say, pretty serious big T trauma. Is that why they choose nursing? Because they're such loving, caretaking people, because they've learned that when they behave like that, they're safer or they feel safer.
Well, I think there's a couple ways, and I want to just take a moment because you raised such a good point about this whole big T, little t thing. All right. In my professional opinion, and I mean no disrespect to anyone out there, I feel as though that is an outdated paradigm, because what we're talking about is the autonomic nervous system. It is the upstairs brain, the prefrontal and frontal cortex. It's saying big T, little t. And here we are back classifying and comparing and contrasting. And all of that has its place, right? But when we're talking about our lived experience and living in this body, right? The midbrain, the nervous system, and the cells that we have been talking about today gives zero craps about whether the upstairs brain calls it a big T or a little t, because physiologically, the impact is the same.
And isn't it all different for every individual? What's traumatic to you may not be traumatic to me, and vice versa.
Right, and we can't ever know that because each of us has a unique trauma history starting in utero. Right? In utero, it is possible to be traumatized, as I was, right? And it is possible to be traumatized in infancy, as you well know, and attachment, and all of the things, all of the ways in which we are traumatized, which we don't have to unpack all of that here, but we just acknowledge. And so the wild card, is a concept that I put in my book that speaks to this, and I call it our repository. So within each of our bodies and our energy field, so it's not just a physical thing, but it's also an energetic thing. Unintegrated, unhealed trauma, unhealed bits of wisdom have an energetic charge to them, just like anything else in the universe, right? If we want to get quantum about it. And so that presents as static, like radio static or TV static. It's like inflammation in our body, that's static, right? When you are a spiritual practitioner, or you like mindfulness practices, or you have a keen sense of intuition, or however you are in relation to your spiritual walk, which is different for each of us, right? But that presents as static. And so each of us, by virtue of our lived experience, is embodying different types of trauma in different ways. And we don't know. So if you and I right now in our beautiful time together, if we shared some traumatic event happened right now, you and I would have very different responses because of the wild card of what is stored in each of our repositories. So this is where we get back to Dr. Bruce Perry. It's like, well, we start shifting the conversation around, well, what's wrong with you? Oh my God, so and so at work today, eye roll, or which is natural. We've been conditioned in these ways, but then starting to understand that, oh, that behavior, when that person gets super clingy or they get super aggressive or they start checking out or they're habitually late or they're habitually brain foggy or they're habitually like coming at me with some this or that, oh, those are all how their behaviors based on their trauma story, that's their nervous system adaptation. And so we move from what's wrong with you, eye roll, which been there, done that, to oh, I wonder what happened holding my hand over my heart. I wonder what happened in their life story that resulted in this behavior. And now I can recognize it as their trauma response. I don't have to fix anything. I don't have to know anything. The single most important thing I have to do is stay regulated in my own nervous system because that other person is a mammal, just like I'm a mammal. And we are evolutionarily programmed to co regulate with one another. So, by virtue of me staying regulated, if you and I experienced a traumatic event right now and I was able to hold my regulation and or you were able to hold yours, right? Then we would be co-regulating together and you wouldn't have to know a single thing about my trauma history. You wouldn't have to know a single thing about my life story, but you would know the importance of being open and curious and compassionate, that we all have trauma behavioral responses. And the single most important thing we can do for each other is stay regulated in our own nervous system, because that other person's nervous system will sync up and it'll sync up below the level of their higher brain. They won't even know it. It won't even matter. And that's how we've survived over the millennia.
A couple questions. What is part B? You have the three A's plus B. And then I want you to answer my question about nurses.
Yes, so let us finish. So 3 A's: awareness, attending, alignment, plus B for balance, which is all the self-care things we already know. So hydrate, eat right, get enough sleep, be in healthy, life-giving relationships, live in safe units, buildings, homes. Like I was in a home that had toxic mold for 20 years. It almost killed me. We didn't know. We didn't know. And so environmental health is important, and then our financial health, and also taking time to rest and recharge. So all of those things we already know. But that's usually where we start. And we try and self care on top of a dysregulated nervous system. And that's why it's like a house of cards that keeps, yeah, Sunday afternoon, Sunday reset, self care Sunday, and we're all engaged in these beautiful practices. And then we're already like having the dimmer switch come on. Then we get the Sunday scaries the night before because, we know we're going back to the trauma factory, essentially. And so this is why we start with the 3 A's. And then we add the B on top of it. All of the normal self-caring things, keep those. 100, they're important. But they're not sustainable and they don't get to root cause unless you're doing the 3 A's.
So, what do you think are the best ways to regulate your nervous system? Although, as I'm saying this, I'm thinking it's probably different for everyone, right?
That's why the book is here. So we don't have a lot of resources out there that are as user friendly. There are some. Deb Dana, she's sort of the master polyvagal translator.
Can you start with telling us about polyvagal theory. I know I'm asking for a lot, but the vagus nerve, just like a general, like to an eighth grader.
Right, here we go. So we have the upstairs brain, which is higher reasoning. We have the downstairs brain, which is our midbrain and our brainstem and our cerebellum, which does sort of our, think of it, I like to think of it as our kind of reptilian functions. They're automatic. We aren't aware of them, but they're keeping us alive in every moment of every day, right? And from the brain comes 12 cranial nerves, one of which is called the vagus nerve. And the vagus nerve runs all the way down the heart, lungs, diaphragm, all the way down to the gut. It's a big nerve. And so Dr. Stephen Porges's research suggests that the front side of the vagus nerve, which is called the ventral, and the back side of that nerve, which is called dorsal, have different functions. And so he came up with a brilliant body of science. I'm just going to tell you how it works. In our midbrain, it's not a literal structure, but it is a conversational structure for teaching purposes. He calls it the threat detector. And the threat detector is surveying for signs of danger outside of us and also within us. So if we're having an internal situation, that is also will be perceived as a cue of a threat to our safety in some fashion, real or perceived. Okay? So just because I'm afraid of the saber-toothed tiger that's outside my window that isn't outside your window doesn't mean it's not here, because I'm perceiving it as being here, right? And so what that happens is it signals to our vagus nerve, whew, conditions are safe. Conditions are safe. There's no saber-toothed tiger. Everything, all is well. So ventral, the front side of that vagus nerve, your dimmer switch can come online. And you can be grounded and you can be centered. You can see the big picture. You can connect with your loved ones because you feel safe. You are able to be still because you feel safe. You are able to play because we can't play if we don't feel safe, which is a big part of my trauma history, is that, play wasn't ever available to me, right? And so we want to be in that ventral vagal. I call it green. If we think of a stoplight, we want to be in green. Green is for go, green is for good. But let's just say we have too much stress in our inner or outer world, or we have trauma exposures, which is most of us in our workplaces, any number, which we can unpack another time, but there's all sorts of occupational trauma that people are being inflicted upon them, much of which is avoidable, right? So what happens is we go into what I call the yellow, which is our sympathetic response, and most of us know that as flight or flee or fawning, which is if we can't run away or we can't attack it, then we just say, yes, ma'am, no, ma'am, what do you need? What do you need me to do? And we go through the motions again as a survival response, right? And so that's our yellow light, which is sympathetic response. But then because that's supposed to be a short-term thing, but we have chronic stress. We have chronic trauma exposure. And so we go into what I call sympathetic overdrive. Now that yellow light is getting orange. Okay, because we are not physiologically capable of managing that degree of stress. And when it gets to a point where it's unmanageable, when that threat detector process in the midbrain says, whoo, the mitochondria, back to those cell danger response, right? The mitochondria literally cannot produce the energy needed. Cannot. It's like you're trying to drive your car across the desert on a quarter of tank of gas. It's not going to make it, right? And so the midbrain, this threat detector process comes in and says, dorsal, backside of that vagus nerve, dorsal vagal, please come online. Shut it down. Put them in energy conservation mode. And that's why we have refractory chronic fatigue.
So is that the red?
That's the red. Yeah, so that's called the freeze response. And this is where we get hopeless, we're overwhelmed, we start shutting down, we are numb, we feel dissociated, we're not able to connect with our loved ones. We have all these beautiful plans on our days off, and all we can do is grab our phone for takeout and our remote control for a streaming day. And that is not a judgment, that is a physiological response that it is suggesting that either your unintegrated trauma or your chronic stress load and or your avoidable trauma exposure at work is more than your organism, more than the physiology can manage.
Lori, that is the best explanation that I have ever heard for polyvagal and how this all works. You know what? It's like my brain could see the colors and the pictures, and I was able to follow it because I think it generally it's kind of confusing.
It can be confusing. Yeah, and it's far more complex than that, but that's the basics of all we need to know really to get started. And from those three, from the green to the yellow to the orange to the red light, just like a color wheel, you can mix and match. There's hybrids that result from those that gets a little bit more nuanced, and we talk about those in the book. But if you have that, you are ready to start working on your 3A's. That's all that is required to start working on the 3A's.
Yeah, no, I think that was so helpful. Okay, so nursing question. And the reason I have this question is because I think nursing is one of the most ADHD compatible careers. It's fast paced, it's hands on, high empathy, never the same day twice, right? So for women with ADHD, that constant stimulation and sense of purpose, I think it can feel like a perfect fit. But the same traits that make them great nurses, I think also probably leave them vulnerable to burnout and especially when there's trauma in the mix. So I'm curious what your research and just like your lived experience has been around the kinds of people who choose nursing as a career, both men and women.
There's a couple of broad stroke categories. A lot of times it's people who have been traumatized, like myself, or have been through a trauma with a loved one. Oftentimes in childhood, mom, dad, grandparent, sister, brother, experienced cousin, experienced some. So in my case, I grew up with grandparents, both of whom were pre-polio vaccine. And so both of my parents, my grandmother was in a wheelchair, paralyzed from the diaphragm down, and my grandfather had use of only one of his legs. And so, when we're young, I was a certified nursing assistant. So at 15, I was helping people transition at end of life. From 15, while other girls were babysitting and waiting tables, I was in a skilled nursing facility, doing end of life transitions.
How did that happen?
That was just the part-time job that I chose. I don't know, it was my healer's heart. Maybe because I grew up with grandparents that were, so this is how it goes, right? Right? Something touches us as young children, and oftentimes it's a trauma of sorts that we have a desire, because our loved one is okay, we have a desire to give back, right? And so some people call that a calling, but a calling has been weaponized against nurses. It's an empathy manipulation tool. Oh, but it's your calling to be abused at work. Oh, but it's your calling. I stay way away from that. But many of us have had a lived experience that profoundly affected us in ways that we are drawn to help other people get through a similar situation in their life, because we now have some wisdom. Even 15-year-old me helping people literally pass away, that was something that I could bring forward. So that's one category. Trauma begets trauma. Neurospicy begets neurospicy. ADHD begets, the way that we have adapted in response to the traumas that we have endured, it changes the architecture of our brain and then the behavioral responses resulting therefrom. And that's how we find ourselves. How did you find yourself to be where you are? You probably have a similar story, as does every one of your beautiful community members. And so that's one major category. And then there's another category of people who just really see it as an honorable profession where you can make, a good, comfortable living, and there's nothing wrong with that either. They're there because it's a good profession, and many of us choose our professional roles for those reasons. And so those tend to be the two main people. But the reasons, is some fun facts about nurses and healthcare professionals. It's not just nurses, it's all of us. I call it occupational work-related trauma, for healers, nurses, and helping professionals and health professionals, right? Because we're all kind of, facilitating healing in different ways in systems that aren't designed for healing to happen. Right, which is a whole existential crisis, type of, existential trauma. And so some fun facts is that 86% of nurses nurses have a tremendous trauma exposure, not only by virtue of the work that we do, because we get some training on that vicarious secondary trauma, but we have historical trauma where we have traditionally been oppressed and marginalized, secondary to patriarchal and colonial forces. So there's some systemic things where nurses are considered subordinate. Evidence of this is that, most providers, healthcare providers, they have a reimbursement schedule. There's a fee schedule for the services that they provide, what an insurance company will pay. You want to know what nurses are considered? They are part of the room charge. We are chattel. We are no different than the pillow that is on the bed.
I read a book, Invisible Women, and it's all about the data as it relates to sexism and gender discrimination and all of that. And I was shocked. What I was now aware of was how dangerous it is to be a nurse, like literally physical harm. I'm not talking about picking someone up and hurting your back, which is bad enough. No, I'm talking about physical abuse, violence.
Well, let me tell you, in this last year, I have spoken at a couple of national nursing conferences and healthcare conferences where I've had, a mix of healthcare professionals. And so I've had over 400 people in my audience. And I had my assistant with me, and I said, I want you to count the hands that go up, because I'm going to ask this really important question. And I want to, put this in my newsletter, and I want to, bring awareness to this when I ask this particular question. And so my assistant is ready. We got it all sorted, and I'm up there at the podium doing my thing. And I asked the question, which was, raise your hand if you, like me, have experienced any form of workplace violence that looks like being hit, kicked, hair pulled, spit upon, feces, urine, or other bodily fluids thrown on you, scratched, clawed, or punched. Raise your hand, because every single one of those things has happened to me. My hand is up for every single one of those things, and you are safe in this space to raise your hand if you feel comfortable. My assistant could not count the hands that went up. She could only count the hands that did not go up, and out of 400 people, that was 18.
I can't believe there were 18, given what you're telling me. And I think it's getting worse and worse.
It is getting far worse. And this is a real problem. And so then there's another form of trauma that happens right after that is called system-induced trauma. This happens every single day. That if you follow, so I'm a nurse, I'm actively in my practice, and I have been battered in my professional role. And I am following the policy, and I am going, and I'm filing my report, and I am escalating up the chain of command, and I am now sitting in front of my manager's office. Do you want to know what the first question nurses are asked after they have been battered in the line of duty, which we did not sign up for? We don't get training for.
The way you say it, I'm assuming it's like, what did you do to cause this?
Right. What could you have done differently? I got goosebumps. 100%. You ask any nurse, and I invite your community members to do the same. Ask the nurses, what's the question that you get asked after you have been assaulted in the line of duty?
That's like, what's wrong with you?
Yeah, it's blame the victim gaslighting culture.
Wow.
And so nurses, because, we're chattel and we're part of a room charge and not a valued linchpin of our healthcare system, without whom there would be no healthcare, right? And so that's an example of system-induced trauma. And see, all of this is avoidable. The insufficient resources the workplace incivilities, the workplace violence. So this is trauma exposure on top of trauma exposure. And it's not just nurses, it's educators, it is the legal profession, it is social workers, it is counselors, it's mental health professionals, it's all of us. It's all of us. And that's why I wrote the book, because it's trauma on top of trauma on top of trauma, and what is driving people from the profession. Because by the end of this decade, the world will have half the number of nurses it needs. Half. And this is why. So that's why I chose to do my own research. That is why I chose to write a book that can get into the living rooms of people rather than writing a textbook that would only be seen by a handful of academics, which is where this research would be expected to be situated given my day job. But no, it's like, no, I'm taking it right to the people. Someone has to do something, and apparently that's me, because I'm willing to work for 6 years and invest 6 figures of my own money and 6 years of my own time to get this out there, and then go to beautiful podcasts such as yours and run my mouth to get this information out there in ways that people can understand and go, whoa, I think it's not necessarily stress at work. Yes, there's always stress at work, said every person who's employed always. That comes with work, comes with life. But it's like, wait, because I did a symptom cluster analysis. So this whole burnout narrative, that also is outdated and it's not trauma informed. So the World Health Organization's definition of burnout, are you ready for this? Occupational stress that has not been effectively managed. Blame the victim, gaslighting. And it shouldn't be considered in non-employment context, implying that I have one body and nervous system and brain for work and a different one when I'm not at work. So it's more of this, again, this reductionistic, this patriarchal, this gaslighting, blame the victim culture. That is why it's so important that, smart-ass women such as you and your community, that we have these conversations and we start thinking. Because when I did the symptom cluster analysis, which is a big old fancy way of saying that I analyzed the symptoms of burnout, of compassion fatigue, and of trauma. 89 to 95% overlap in the symptoms. So burnout is a convenient gaslighting narrative intended to keep us small, intended to keep us feeling as though we are less than and that we are somehow deficient or have a deficit, as opposed to challenging that assumption, which is what, I'm inviting all of you to join me in that challenge of rethinking burnout, rethinking compassion fatigue, because neither of those classic definitions or the evidence surrounding those considers organizational factors, system factors, or work-related trauma exposure. Those are not trauma-informed evidence bases. And even the curriculum that we're teaching our nurses, because that's what I do for my day job. I'm an integrative nursing professor. And so I'm involved at the national level looking at, the curriculum of how every nursing school in the country is training our nurses. And it's no different for medicine or any of the other disciplines. And there is no cell danger response theory in the curriculum. There's no polyvagal theory. It's the same purple Kool-Aid of burnout. You got to do better self-care, which, as you can see, self-care on top of a dysregulated, traumatized nervous system doesn't help.
Capitalism at its best.
It is capitalism at its best.
Who cares about people?
Because it requires, and that's why it requires a new medical device and a new pill, and it requires a new innovation. And that is why nurses who provide holistic care are considered chattel, because they can't monetize me holding your hand while you're drawing your last breaths, right? It can't put a price tag on that. So guess what? We just won't. We'll just call them part of the room.
Right.
Right? Capitalism.
And sexism.
and sexism and ageism. Yeah, so there's so many systemic issues, and this is why, why I wrote, and I was very clear, just, as though we're having this conversation. This is how I write. Right now, we have a profession, and many professions, not just mine, that we have traumatized people who are essentially, metaphorically, hemorrhaging from their wounds, right? From their trauma wounds. And this is, and because we have this burnout narrative in place, and we have this compassion fatigue narrative in place, that we aren't getting the healing, the systemic, the deep cellular autonomic nervous system healing that is required, which keeps us unwell. And when we're unwell, we can't come together as global communities or international or even organizational communities to require the change that is needed. Now, is that by design? Is it not by design? I'm going to let each of you contemplate
Yeah.
that. So the healing starts with each of us individually first. We have to attend to our hemorrhaging wounds, right? If you saw someone bleeding out on the street, you wouldn't go ask them to meditate with you. You would attend to those hemorrhaging wounds and then start healing, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, going right up. And so we all are responsible to heal that which has been inflicted upon us or experienced by us. That is each of our own personal responsibility, and that's part of the B for balance, is accepting that personal responsibility. Even though a crap ton of dumpster fire, really, really, really bad things have happened to me, and they have, I am not responsible for the perpetrators or the circumstances. I am responsible for my healing around that which I have experienced. So we all start there. And we have to also do that together in community. There's an individual, but most of us, the left shifted part of us, we want to crawl in a cave and go heal by ourselves because there's shame. There's shame and blame around being vulnerable and being seen in our woundedness, right? So we all have to warrior up and put on our veneer and our shield. No, what we need, and that's why I started the nonprofit, and I have programs that are private and safe, where people can use pseudonyms and avatars so they never have to reveal their identity because, it's vulnerable work. This is very vulnerable work. And so they have a safe place to come. And I have a 12-week program that can be done in up to a year. So self-pace as your nervous system, as your life rhythms, as your trauma story, which I don't need to know, but I'm here to help you with, right? And so that we can unwind that nervous system and we can get the cells out of danger response. They're stuck right now for most of us.
Do you only work with nurses or do you work with anyone?
So my population is really healers, nurses, and health professionals. Because we have a lot of healers like body workers, massage therapists, the people who are physically holding the energy of the trauma as it's being liberated from the body. They need help too, right? Our energy healers. So wherever you find yourself on the healing spectrum, on the most integrative to the most biomedical, if you're in that space, and that also includes if you're a teacher, if you're a law enforcement, if you're a legal profession, it's the same. Your body doesn't care. That's upstairs brain stuff. So if you have an autonomic nervous system, a vagus nerve, and cells in your body, I can help. You're in.
Where can people find you if they want to know more about you and what you do, your book? Give us everything.
Thank you. My website is probably the best place. So that's drlorrelaws.com. And I'm going to spell that because my mom got creative. So it's drlorrelaws.com. I have a free assessment where you can check to see if and how you've been affected by trauma. And then I have a deep dive assessment, which includes a session with me to unpack that. I have free master classes. I have free resources for the book that you can download the end of chapter activities in a colorful PDF that's more enjoyable to do those healing activities. I have information about the Academy and so much more. There's a community on Facebook, and I'm on social media everywhere at Dr. Lorre Laws.
They can find everything there at Dr. Lorre Laws.
Yep.
I love this conversation. Thank you so much for spending time with us here.
It is my pleasure. What a beautiful community. And I will come back and see y'all anytime.
You're welcome anytime. So that's what I have for you for this week. If you liked this episode with Dr. Lorre Laws, please let us know by leaving a review. Our goal is to change the conversation around ADHD, helping as many women as we possibly can learn how their ADHD brains work so that they too may discover their amazing strengths. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll see you here next week.